I was born to Dutch parents and grew up in Pretoria. I grew up English speaking, went to an English school, while Debbie was born to a father that came to Holland when he came to South Africa from Holland when he was 13, married an Afrikaans-speaking lady. She also grew up in Pretoria. I came to know the Lord in the Methodist Church in Littleton, and at a young age, my mother led me to the Lord. I was did catechism and confirmation in the Methodist Church, aware of the fact that I was a child of God and wanted to follow Him. And when I met Debbie and proposed to her, we met each other at the Hatfield Church in Pretoria. When I proposed, or in the process of that, I explained to her that I felt a call to ministry. I was at that time working secularly and didn't know what it entailed. And when eventually I was encouraged by Pastor Ed, as we called him, to go and apply at the Baptist Theological Seminary, I did that, was accepted, and Debbie had just qualified as a physiotherapist, and for 4 years she supported us while I went to Johannesburg each day for my theological diploma. At the end of that, we were invited to pastor a small Baptist church in Bedfordview. And when I was to go there, I met Leon van Daal, and after almost 18 months, March 1983, on Sunday the 6th of March, his church and our church amalgamated, and we formed Cornerstone, which many of you know. And from that moment on, I became an elder, and Leon was the team leader. I was then on the team that Leon was leading, and would be at Cornerstone until 1994, when we would leave to go to Holland. So just that background, with that context, I want to share what I've been asked to share today. And as Mark was speaking, there are a lot of things that he said that I have planned to say as a result of the question that we got, or the indication that we'd all been given as the theme for this week. And so it's not strange that he said a lot of things that I had planned to say, and that Rob after me, it's more difficult for Rob because but I want to say that the experience, the truths in general terms will be the same, but the experience is different. I was not called to Portugal, but to Holland. And I want to start by saying that it has to do, the theme is pioneering through responding to the call of God. For Caleb, it was taking hold of the mountain that God had promised him. For Moses, it was to lead the people out of their slavery in Egypt. For Joshua, it was to lead the people into something else. For David, the call was to be the king. For Solomon, it was, among others, to build the temple. There is a general call that is applicable to all of us. For instance, to follow Christ, as Mark said last night. But also, each believer is called to serve Christ the King. Each believer is called to be His witnesses. And each believer is called to be a disciple maker. That's general, that is true for every one of us. But then there is also the specific call. And the specific call has to do with how God calls you to be His witness. Or not how God calls you to be His witness, but the manner in which He wants you to be His witness. And the manner in which He wants you to be His disciple maker. And that would mean that for the one it will be a call. God calls him to become an engineer or a doctor or a housewife or a secretary or a computer buff. And there to live out his followership of Jesus Christ and be a disciple maker and a witness. And others He will call, and so the emphasis this week, of course, is in the area of leading within the church context, planting church and so forth. So I will focus there with regard to our story. But I want you to know that the call of God, it's not that those who've been called to ministry, those who've been called to eldership, or even a deacon in the church, that call is superior to any other call. For me, the call of God is this: doing His will in my life and following His instructions for my life. It is doing what God requires of us to do. So if after this week you have not received a call to go and plant a church in Timbuktu, but are convicted in your heart and feel so strong that you as a pilot may have to take a job in Dubai, then follow the call of God. There have been pilots in Dubai, among other places, that I've heard of, who have gone there and have opened doors for others to be able to come and plant a church. And so the call to Abram was different to the call to Noah. There was only one Noah ever called to build an ark. So be aware of that. And so I'd like to start where our season in South Africa ended. And I wanted to obey, Debbie and I wanted to obey the call of God for our lives. And we were at a conference in those days. They weren't called LTTs, they weren't called Equips. They had no name, but twice a year we would meet. Dudley would invite us to go, and we met at the Drakensberg Gardens Hotel. And this particular time was 1991 or 2. Dudley had just moved to Australia and came back regularly. And we were at a conference where Dudley spoke. It was in a big tent. And he spoke about the fact that so often as churches we have sent out missionaries of people, and then it is a caricature, it's general thing, but the people that went out were people that felt the call of God, no doubt about that, but were those people who didn't really fit in the local church setting. And they would go, and often it would be ladies, and then you would support them. They would come back every 3 years and do their spiel, get some more money, support, and they would go out again. And Dudley was saying that what he sees in the scripture is that those who have done it and have gained some experience in that field are the ones that moved on and did it again. And the challenge that he gave in that particular meeting was, those of you who have been doing it for a while in the context of leading within the church, have you made yourself available to the Lord to say, Lord, I'm happy and open to go and do it again or elsewhere? And Debbie and I both stood at that time not knowing what it would mean. My first point, I've got a few points. My first point is, ask God to show you what He has for you, what He wants from you. In that asking, you've got to open your heart. We lived with that attitude. In the amalgamation of our two churches, when Cornerstone was formed, it was seeking the Lord's will. And God spoke. And every time a major event has taken place in my life, it has been because of scriptures that God has used. Others things have confirmed it, but it's been a scripture. And so our heart was open. When we stood there, we didn't know what it would mean, but we said, Lord, we are willing. We were comfortable in Cornerstone. I never thought that there would be anything other than Cornerstone. There have been times that I've longed back to Cornerstone. But we said, Lord, show us. We are open. We are open. And that's where it starts. From the moment that we become Christians, our heart should be, Lord, show me that your kingdom can come in my life, but how? And your will be done in my heart as it is in heaven. Show me how. That is applicable to every area of our lives. Choosing your partner, where you're going to live, where to send your kids to school is, Lord, show us your will. In Jeremiah 1 verse 4, and I'm going to use a bit of Jeremiah. I'm also going to go elsewhere, but maybe Jeremiah, if you can open your Bible to Jeremiah chapter 1. So the question is, Lord, where and how do you want me to carry out your general call in my life? What is your specific call where I can carry out the general call? In Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 4, the word of the Lord came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I set you apart. Each one of us has been set apart in the sense that God has got something specific for each one of us. That's why He gives different gifts. That's why He raises us in different families. That's why He places us in environments to shape us and form us for the specific thing that He has for us. So before you were born, I knew you, I set you apart, I appointed you, and this was His specific calling at this point in time. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. But we don't always know that. Many of the things that have developed and happened in our lives, and let me only refer to the positive things, only when we have gotten there and past that point and looked back, we've seen how God has called us to that. So long before the time, I've not known the things. As I said, when I told Debbie I felt a call to ministry, I didn't know exactly what it was. In fact, when I was still in the Methodist Church at the end of primary school, my mother was a Christian, my dad wasn't, but I had a music stand of my dad, and we used to have like devotions, and I used to sometimes take the Bible and put up the music stand and stand in the lounge and felt something about being a minister one day, as vague as that understanding was. And so it developed, it faded away, and it came again. And so the call of God may be that He wants you to play another role. Are you prepared as a leader to play another role? Are you prepared as a home group leader to be open to the fact that He may not want you to lead a home group anymore, but start a children's ministry? So, Lord, show me. I'm prepared to do what you call me. It could be that He instructs you to operate in another context. That's what we thought. When we stood that day in that conference, responding to that call of God through a man, and we started praying about it and thinking about it, we thought that we would go and start something. Even the term planting a church didn't really come up in us. It was new to us in those days, even in Cornerstone. And we thought that it may be starting something, a work in Buccleuch, which was a new area in Johannesburg being developed on the Rand. And so we went there, we started praying along those lines. So the call, we thought at that stage, will be in a different context, just a few kilometers down the road. It may be working with people of the culture you're in, and that God calls you to do the same thing, but in another culture. It could mean that God wants you to move from one suburb to another, or from one country to another, or even from one language group to another language group. And when God drops something in your heart, and this is also what Mark said last night, or something like this, have it confirmed. Ask the Lord to confirm it. There are people who have had a prophetic word over them, spoken over them. They've never thought of it. They've never desired that. And just because they've gotten that word, they've responded and gone. I think it's very wise what Mark said is, well, he did it this way. He got the prophetic word and he threw it there in his file. But we've got to weigh those things up and put them there, and the day will come when they will make sense. Maybe not all of it, but ask the Lord to confirm it. I will tell you just now that happened with us. But it is very important that whatever God calls us to do, especially when it will affect other people, first of all your family, but other people, that you know that you have a clear call from God and that it's been confirmed. And what is great, I discovered later, is that there are a lot of people who back you in that. Because although we were lonely in one way when we went across to Holland, we were felt so safe because there was a whole group of men and women who backed us, supported us, even came across to us. The importance of a clear calling, especially going through difficult times. You know, when the first group of exiles went back after 70 years living in Babylon in exile, and they went back to Jerusalem, they went under the group of Zerubbabel led them. Read this in Acts. In Ezra, the book of Ezra. And 50,000 people went back. They didn't all go to lead home groups. They didn't all go to plant churches. They didn't all go to play in the worship team. But they all went, 50,000 people, all sorts of people, even some of the scum of the earth, went under the leadership of Zerubbabel. They took a journey of 4 months. There were no jets in those days. I think the longest trip that was made here was by Dean and Lisa, or Brian and Lisa from Canada, 26 hours in the aeroplane or something to get here. That wasn't even an option in those days. It took a journey of 4 months. Can you imagine going through the desert in the heat of the day and in the cold at night? There were robbers. There were wild animals. There you're going with 50,000 people, small kids. 4 months journey, having to find water, having to find shelter. Who in his right mind would want to embark on such a journey, except for what there stands in Ezra chapter 1 verse 5? Those whose heart the Spirit of God had touched went up to Jerusalem. When the tough times come, and may I prophesy, they will. For those who can understand Afrikaans, snot en trane is part of the journey at times. But those times, when you're there in the desert, halfway, not knowing how long it's still going to take, it's cold at night, and the day the sun burns you, it's important that you know that God has called me to this. So the first one is, ask the Lord. The second point is, the call may come unexpectedly, out of the blue. So we had said yes, and we were looking at the possibility of Buccleuch. In the meantime, Wayne Neuper, one of the elders in the church, came and said he was just recently an elder a year, and he felt that God was calling him to go and plant a church in Benoni. And so a lot of the things were happening. It was the first church plant out of Cornerstone. And he left in January 1993. And in that period, we were still praying as he was preparing. And in August of 1992, I was driving down. We had a building that we had our offices at. It was a small building, but we had our offices there. And I drove to work, dropped the kids off, and drove to work that morning to the office. And it was my custom that I would have my quiet time there. And Leon had also said that before a certain time, I think it was 9 o'clock or so, we should be not out of our offices, but just spending time with the Lord. And I was driving down. I know exactly the place where it happened. I was driving in my car, and I felt the Lord said to me, I want to send you to Holland. I told you I'm from Dutch parents. In the mid-80s, my dad, who was quite negative and pessimistic, my dad said to me, why don't you go and see if you can get a Dutch passport? I was cross with my dad. I said, I'm a South African. I didn't need a Dutch passport. I said, but why? He says, because of the way things are developing here in the country, then you can at least get out. So I said, I was angry with my dad. I don't need a Dutch passport. That was my attitude. I was critical of people who went on the chicken run. And so now God speaks to me in the car. And I said, Lord, those stubborn and obstinate people. Because I'd had some experience. My father-in-law, also Dutch. His parents, the grandparents of Debbie, very obstinate, very stubborn, eigenwijs. So I said, Lord, what about our kids? Our children were then 8 and 10. So I get to the office, and I had decided that morning I was going to start in Ezekiel, my quiet time, my quiet reading, my own personal reading. Now, Ezekiel was not something that I'd often read because it wasn't a favorite book. It's difficult to understand it. But that morning I opened Ezekiel, sat in my chair, and I'd like you to turn to Ezekiel. Maybe you don't want to turn there, but I'm going to read from it. Keep your finger in Jeremiah. So in Ezekiel, he says that there was a moment that God speaks to him and says, Son of man, stand up, I want to talk to you. And then in verse 3 of chapter 2, it says, I am sending you to the Israelites, to a rebellious people. Verse 4, the people to whom I am sending you are obstinate and stubborn. The exact words I'd used in the car. Verse 6, do not be afraid of them or their words. Do not be afraid, though briars and thorns are all around you, and you live among scorpions. And that aspect spoke so clearly to me that the Lord said I'd raise the issue of raising our kids in a country like that. And although my parents come from Holland, I had the picture that everybody has of Holland, and that is Amsterdam, and that everything may and is allowed and happens there. That's the picture. Our picture had to be adjusted once we got to the area where we got to. But I felt that the Lord said to me with regard to our kids, do not be afraid of the briars and the thorns and the scorpions. I will take care of your kids. Do not be afraid of what they say or be terrified by them, though they are a rebellious people. Verse 7, you must speak my words to them. You must speak my words to them, whether they listen or fail to listen. And that's happened. Many have listened, but others are not listening. We are longing to have more people listen, not to Gert's words, but to his words, where I am at currently. And sometimes it's tough. And when you've been there for 9 years and the people are still not listening, many of them are not listening as I think they should listen to the Word of God. But whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are rebellious. Verse 8, a little way on, listen to what I say to you. Do not rebel like that rebellious people. Open your mouth and eat what I give you. So then I'm sitting there flabbergasted. I'm what? Gobsmacked. What is it? Gobsmacked. I couldn't believe this. I could not believe it. It was so clear. And I know I'm not an Israelite, I'm not a Jew, but the word was so specific because of those very words that I'd spoken and the things I'd said about the kids. So in verse, as if that was not enough, I carry on reading chapter 3, verse 5. You are not being sent to a people of obscure speech. Although I'd never learned to read or write Dutch, could write Afrikaans and English, but I'd never learned to read or write and the grammar of the Dutch. I could speak. My parents kept on speaking Dutch, so it was mixed with Afrikaans and English, but I could communicate. You are not being sent to a people of obscure speech and difficult language. Well, that was wrong because Dutch is a difficult language, the grammar, but to the house of Israel. And for me, that was back to your roots. Not to many people of obscure speech and difficult language whose words you cannot understand. And so when that word came to me, August 1992, I didn't know what to do with it. On the one hand, I was so excited that God was saying something to me, and God had seen me and had something for me other than what I was doing at that point in time. And so I kept it in my heart. And in February, I think it was Friday the 12th, we had an elders meeting on the Friday morning, and Leon was talking about some things, and he felt some changes needed to take place, and at that point in time it wasn't that clear, but Leon was actually making us aware that there were changes coming with regard to his future in Cornerstone. And so he was talking about things, and I sat there and I thought, this is going to affect that, whatever that is going to be. And so after the meeting, when we were all gone, when the meeting was dismissed, I went to Leon. I said, Leon, I need to talk to you. And I said, in light of what you were sharing this morning, I feel I need to tell you what is happening in my life. And so I shared this with him. I also shared with him some of the confirmation that came between August and February that nobody knew. I want you to know, Debbie knew of nothing. Nothing. She said to me, I must promise that I will never ever do that again. I did promise. And so, in the meantime, I can't tell you all the things, but the confirmations that came, the things, even our 10-year-old son said something that he couldn't know. And so Leon says, but what does Debbie say about this? I said, Leon, Debbie doesn't know. Then Leon says, but first of all, Leon said, I'm not surprised. I am a little surprised that it's now, so early. So he says, what does Debbie say? I said, she doesn't know. He says, you need to tell her today. So I said, Leon, will you pray this afternoon? What? I didn't see what time. What time do you end? 15. So Leon, so I said pray, and I said there's two things that Debbie's going to say. Debbie's going to say, what about the kids? And what about the weather? So that evening after I dropped the kids off at youth club, I came back home and I said, Debbie, I need to talk to you. And we're sitting in the bedroom there, and I tell her what is happening. And of course she starts crying and that. And she says, what about the weather and what about the kids? Just like that. And in between the tears, then she says to me, but I've got to believe that you're serious because I know how adamant you are of staying in South Africa. And then she shared something that the Lord had shown her. Now she understood that the Lord had said something to her about the spies and not being the 10, but being like the 2, and so forth and so forth. So then I shared it with Leon. Obviously I let Leon know how Debbie responded, and then the next phase was that Leon said that we should talk to Dudley, and we spoke to Dudley, and Dudley felt it was of God, and then we shared it with our elders, and so the process started going. My third point is look beyond the impossible or the impossibilities. Mark referred to it last night. The 12 that came back from the promised land when they'd been out as spies had seen all the things, the reality of the grapes and the milk and the honey, the beauty of the country, and the reality of that there were giants. That's real. You cannot deny it. 10 of them were intimidated by the little negative. 2 of them focused on the positive and focused on the fact that God was calling. There will always be situations that seem impossible. In the meantime, we had gone to Holland for a holiday and to look what doors would open. Then discovered that there was no way of us getting in. In the meantime, I had applied for a Dutch passport and I got it, and I could get our kids on it. But Debbie could no longer get a Dutch passport because her father had naturalized in the meantime. So then we realized, I can't tell you all the details, but then we realized that I needed to get a job in order to bring Debbie with me, and I wasn't going without her. I needed a job and I needed a home. Those were the requirements. And in a miraculous way, I knew nobody in this place. I got a telephone number of somebody in South Africa, of somebody in Holland. I phoned them up. They invited me for a meal. I was alone then, invited me for a meal, told them my story, asked them, and then Saturday, that was Tuesday night, and Saturday the people phoned me up and said, we met somebody at a funeral yesterday, and he would like to meet you. So I went to meet him in this place, this town, and he said, I've heard your story. He asked me a few questions. He says, I can offer you a job. And he had a factory. He's a Christian. He had a factory where he made these, like, I don't know if they are food trucks here, but they are wagons, trailers, like a caravan that that opens up on the side. Fridge moves out. On the markets in Europe, they're all over to be seen. So he said, what can you do? I said, well, I'm a handy guy, so I think that I could manage. And then I needed a home. And it's a very difficult, every country is different, but in Holland it's very difficult to rent a home. And if you want to rent a home that is payable, for most people in England they call them, I think, council homes. In Holland they have a different system. And so the man that was now going to employ me said to me, you need to go and enroll. So I went to the municipality and I said, I want to put my name down on the list. And then they told me 2,500 or something. And I came back and the man said to me, so what did they say? I said, they gave me a number, 2,500 or whatever it was. I said, but I don't know what that means. He says that you're going to wait a very long time for such a home. So then he said, so the other option is that we look for a home that you can rent privately, but that's much more expensive. And he knew what I was going to earn. I didn't know. And even if he told me what I was going to earn, it didn't make any sense because I didn't know what things cost and how much I needed. And so I heard of a home that a Christian organization, a South African Christian organization in that town, they were renting homes from some institution. And their missionaries were no longer going to be there. And so I heard this home was available. So I went to that organization. I asked them, I said, well, there's a bestuur, there's a board that looks after this. You need to go and visit this man. So I tell the man let me call him my boss. I tell my boss that I've got to go and see this Mr. Henk Moren about the home. So he says to me, oh, I'll go with you because he's my accountant. So now I'm still in South Africa, but I'm there for a visit. So I'm not living there, nothing. So I go with him to this office, and I meet this man, and the man says, I hear that you want to rent a home. He says, I said, yes. He says, but do you know that the owner is selling that house? And that's how it works. If you have a tenant in your home, it's almost impossible to sell it. You can't put the tenant out. So only when the owner now has nobody interested in renting it anymore, he's able to sell it. So he says the owner wants to sell the house. I said, yes, I've heard that. He says, but I've heard of your story. And I felt that the Lord said to me that I must buy that house so that you can rent it from me. And that's where we ended up, in the town where we then started in our home. Later, a church came out of that, and it's the town where Rob and Laura now live. We no longer live there. They're in another church now because their story is different. I won't tell you their story. Let Rob have a few points. But don't make or embrace excuses by the giants that you see in the land, however intimidating they may be. Moses said he was unworthy and not eloquent. Gideon felt he was too insignificant. Jeremiah said he was too young. Jonah did not feel like obeying. Ananias was afraid to go and meet Saul and pray for him. And so we can go down the road. God promises to be and go with us. I'm going to cut it. Jeremiah 1 verse 7, but the Lord said to me, do not say I'm too young. You must go to everyone I send you and say whatever I command you. So as you go, I will command you what the next step is, and I will provide a job, and I will provide a home. And I will provide a school for your children, and I will provide the ability, and so forth and so forth. Where God calls, he will provide. Verse 9, then the Lord reached out his hand and touched my mouth and said to me, I have put my words in your mouth. God requires that we obey him unconditionally. He said to Jeremiah in 1 verse 7, you must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. My fourth point, God's call does not mean that it will be convenient or easy. Abram was called to leave his father's land and go to the land that God would show him. When he ends up in the land that God had showed him to come in, what happened? Drought. Moses was called to lead the people out of Egypt. So eventually Moses, after all his excuses, God convinces him. God tells him, I'll give you your brother Aaron to go with you. They go to the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh says, rubbish. Make those Hebrews work harder. The Hebrew foremen see how they suffer. Now they've got to find their own straw and whatever. They're suffering more than they were suffering before. So who do they turn to? Moses, that reluctantly had said to the Lord, I will go. God's call does not mean that it will be convenient or easy. As soon as Moses started, eventually, they've moved out, his brother and sister turn against him. Then Korah and his mates and 250 other leaders turn against him. God's call doesn't mean that it's easy. Mark said last night that his wife did cry and sometimes said, I don't want to be here. I think I represent you correctly. My wife has cried, but my wife has never said, why did you bring me here? She never has. I have said that to the Lord, but not to my wife. But both of us will be able to tell you that sometimes it's been very, very hard. As they say in Canada, bleri moeilik. Number 5, prepare yourself. And you may say, how? And I'm going to just mention them quickly. My time is up. Develop an intimacy with God. You'll need this from your safe place. Be faithful in what you're currently doing. I have seen people who have felt the call of God and have dropped everything where they are, and they've left a mess. God will not call you to just drop that and leave those sheep without a shepherd. Be faithful. If you're in children's ministry, I've had it. We had a splant in our church, and people left. And there were one or two people that told me yesterday, we are not going with a new thing. And the home group leader and Sunday school work. And a day later, they phoned and they said, we're leaving. Home group leaders just left. Don't do that. Be faithful in what you're currently doing and seek to end well. Work at becoming mature in character, heart attitudes, and values. Allow yourself to be corrected. Once while I was on team with Leon and we were together then for 11 years, there were a few times that Leon challenged me on issues in my own life. I didn't like it. At the moment, I didn't like it. I remember one time sitting there, Leon talking to me, tears streaming down. But I worked at it. Once I was in Holland and I was all alone. I was so grateful that I was challenged and corrected and reshaped in a safe environment, because if those things now came to the surface, who was there to help me? Open yourself. Ask your leaders, is there anything? Build a strong and healthy marriage relationship, and together prepare your children. We started preparing our children, taking them with us because they're part of the call. They were young. They weren't in the age group that Mark and Hattie's children were in. Ours went with us, 12 and 10 at the time. But we prepared them, we helped them. It's going to be different. We tried to make it also exciting. It's an adventure. There are new opportunities, as much as you understand yourself. But prepare them. Develop the required and the necessary skills. I'm so grateful that Leon at times gave us things to do as elders. He asked us, will you lead that now for the next season? And it was youth work, or I was in the admin and finance and everything. I'm so grateful for all those things. Even at times when he gave us as elders, leaders to look after in the church, and he gave me one, I'd said, please don't give me that leader. He gave me that leader. Jim had also said, Leon, please don't give me that leader, but he gave him to me, not to Jim. And afterwards, I realized that God was using all of that, was using Leon to prepare me to develop skills that I would one day be able to use, and that I didn't have to learn those things while I'm now having to learn a lot of other new things. Share your heart, your call, your vision with somebody mature and honest. Don't go and share that you feel God is calling you to plant a church 3 kilometers down the road with somebody in the same church that you're at the moment who also has problems with Richard. Now, I know that for you, yeah, that will be a problem to find somebody who has no problems with Richard. But then go to Chris in JB, because he also has problems with Richard. No, but we try and find people who think like us, feel like us, and who will confirm what we want to hear, but be open and say, this is what I feel God says. If Leon and Dudley and those men around me had said, we don't think you should do this, I would have struggled, because it was by now burning so hard in me. But I think I can say, I would have said, okay. Then I must be wrong. Try to visit the place where you feel God has called you. Become familiar with it. Pray for the place. Streamline your life now. Get out of debt. Learn the language if you can. We had lists on our wall with all the things. Be willing to make adjustments. I want to end with William Borden. And I want to say this to those of you who may be at an age where you think you've responded to the call of God, but it seems that it's not come to what it should be. William Borden was born in 1887 in Chicago. His parents were multimillionaires. In those days, even millionaires were very, very scarce. At a young age, when he was 7, I think, his mother became a Christian, and shortly after that, he also gave his life to the Lord. When he graduated from high school, his parents paid for him to do a round-the-world trip. But because he was still 16 or 17, they sent somebody with him, a man who was to look after him. And on that trip, he met different people, missionaries as well, and his heart was changed and challenged. He came back and he started a study at Yale University and was very active as a Christian. He started several ministries within the university and outside. And while at Yale, he attended a missionary conference, and there he felt God calling him to become a missionary to the Muslims living in northwestern China. While at Yale, his father died, and he and his brother became millionaires overnight. But that did not deter him from the call of God to go to China. After graduating from Yale in 1909, William Borden attended the Princeton Theological Seminary. And after that, he decided, en route to northern China, to go to Cairo in Egypt to study Islam and learn the Arabic language which those Muslims in China there spoke. In March 1913, he contracted cerebral meningitis and died a few weeks later. He was 25. You and I would say, why? What a waste. This man gave up everything. He never reached China. The money that it's given away, started ministries, what a waste. Why God? Why God? It is said that shortly after his death, the following was found in his journal that he'd written over the years. The first that he had written was "no reserve." And the date that was next to it suggested that it had been written shortly after he had renounced his fortune in favor of missions. Later he wrote "no retreat," after his father had supposedly told him that he would never hold a position in the family business. And shortly before he died in Cairo, he wrote the words, "no regrets." No reserve, no retreat, no regrets. We look back and we see some success in our ministry, and we also see some failures. We see some high mountains that have been conquered, and we see things that seem to be dead. There have been things spoken over us that we've not seen come to light, which sometimes has disillusioned us. There have been peaks and there have been deep, deep valleys. The ultimate thing is, can we look back and say, I have no regret because I've kept my eyes on the Lord Jesus Christ, and I want to be obedient to Him. The last year has been difficult for us. Finding our way in what is God's next step. Not that I'm thinking of leaving, but just in some of the things that have happened. God, what do you want? I don't think that He will take us to another nation. Word oud. I don't think so. But Lord, what do you have? That's where we're at. Lord, show us. Show us. And through the pain and the suffering, you also become stronger and you learn. But may it not be the fact that we become callous towards people and deaf towards the Lord. Because ultimately, it's not about where you go and what you do. It's about who you're following and obeying. Respond to the call of God, whatever it may be. God bless you.